The role of concentrated power in shaping the ideological framework that dominates perception, interpretation, discussion, choice of action, all of that is too familiar to require much comment. Tonight I'd like to discuss a critically important example. But first, a couple of words on one of the most perceptive analysts of this process, George Orwell. Orwell is famous for his searching and sardonic critique of the way thought is controlled by force under totalitarian dystopia. But much less is not known is his discussion of how similar outcomes are achieved in free societies. He's speaking, of course, of England, and he wrote that although the country is quite free, nevertheless, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. Gave a couple of examples, provided a few words of explanation which were to the point. One particularly pertinent comment was his observation on a quality education in the best schools, where it is instilled into you that there are certain things that it simply wouldn't do to say, or we may add, even to think. One reason why not much attention is paid to this essay is that it wasn't published. It was found decades later in his unpublished papers. It was intended as the introduction to his famous Animal Farm, bitter satire of Stalinist totalitarianism. Why it wasn't published is apparently unknown, but I think perhaps you can speculate. Orwell's observations on thought control under freedom come to mind in considering the raging debate today about the Iran nuclear deal, which currently occupies center stage. I should say it's a raging debate in the United States, virtually alone. In almost everywhere else, the deal has been greeted with relief and optimism, and without even parliamentary review. This is one of the many striking examples of the famous concept of American exceptionalism. The fact that America is an exceptional nation is regularly intoned by virtually every political figure, and I think more revealingly, the same is true of prominent academic and public intellectuals. You can select almost at random. Take, for example, the professor of the science of government at Harvard, who's a distinguished liberal scholar, government advisor. He's writing in Harvard's prestigious journal, International Security, and there he explains that unlike other countries, the national identity of the United States is defined by a set of universal political and economic values, namely liberty, democracy, equality, private property, and markets. So the U.S. has a solemn duty to maintain its international primacy for the benefit of the world. And since this is a matter of definition, we can dispense with the tedious work of empirical verification. So I won't spend any time on that. Or let's turn to the leading left liberal intellectual journal, the New York Review. There, a couple of months ago, we read from the former chair of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that American contributions to international security, global economic growth, freedom, and human well-being have been so self-evidently unique and have been so clearly directed to others' benefit that Americans have long believed that the United States amounts to a different kind of country. While others push their national interests, the United States tries to advance universal principles. No evidence is given because it's, again, a matter of definition. And it's very easy to continue. It's only fair to add that there's nothing at all exceptional about this. American exceptionalism was standard for every great power, very familiar from other imperial states in their days in the sun, Britain, France, others. And this is true, interestingly, even from very honorable figures from whom one might have expected better. So John Stuart Mill, for example, in England, to mention a significant case, which raises interesting questions about intellectual life and intellectual standards. Well, in some respects, American exceptionalism is not in doubt. I just mentioned one example, the current Iran nuclear deal. Here, the exceptionalism of the United States, its isolation, is dramatic and stark. There are actually many other cases, but this is the one I'd like to think about this evening. And in fact, U.S. isolation might soon increase. The Republican organization, I hesitate to say party, is dedicated to undermining the deal in interesting ways with the kind of unanimity that one doesn't find in political parties, though it's familiar in such former organizations as the old Communist Party, democratic centralism. Everyone has to say the same thing. That's one of many indications that the Republicans are no longer a political party in the normal sense, despite pretensions, commentary, and so on. But rather, the former Republican Party has now become a radical insurgency that's abandoned parliamentary politics and, quoting two highly respected, very conservative political commentators, Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein of the right-wing American Enterprise Institute. And in fact, they may succeed in increasing sanctions and even secondary sanctions on other countries and carry out other actions that could lead Iran to opt out of the deal with the United States. With the United States, that is. That, however, need not mean that the agreement is nullified. Contrary to the way it's sometimes presented here, it's not a U.S.-Iran agreement. It's an agreement between Iran and what's called P5+1, the 5 veto-holding members of the Security Council plus Germany. And the other participants might agree to proceed, Iran as well. They would then join China and India, which have already been finding ways to evade the U.S. constraints on interactions with Iran. And in fact, if they do, they'll join the large majority of the world's population, the non-aligned movement, which all along has vigorously supported Iran's right to pursue its nuclear programs as a member of the NPT. But remember that they're not part of the international community. So when we say the international community opposes Iran's policies or the international community does some other thing, that means the United States and anybody else who happens to be going along with it. So we can dismiss them. If others continue to honor the deal, which could happen, the United States will be isolated from the world, which is not an unfamiliar position. That's also the background for the other element of Obama's, what's called Obama's legacy, his other main foreign policy achievement, the beginning of normalization of relations with Cuba. On Cuba, the United States has been almost totally isolated for decades. If you look, say, at the annual votes in the UN General Assembly on the U.S. embargo, they're rarely reported, but the U.S. essentially votes alone. The last one, Israel joined, but of course Israel violates the embargo. They just have to join because they have to join with the master. Occasionally the Marshall Islands or Palau or someone else join. And in the hemisphere, the United States has been totally isolated for years. The main hemispheric conferences have foundered because the United States will simply not join the rest of the hemisphere in the major issues that are discussed. Last one in Colombia, the two major issues were admitting Cuba into the hemisphere. U.S. and Canada refused, everyone else agreed. And the U.S. drug war, which is devastating Latin America, and they want to get out of it, but the U.S. and Canada don't agree. That's actually the background for Obama's acceptance of steps towards normalization of relations with Cuba. Another hemispheric conference was coming up in Panama, and if the United States had not made that move, it probably would have been thrown out of the hemisphere. So therefore Obama made what's called here a noble gesture, a courageous move to end Cuba's isolation, although in reality it was U.S. isolation that was the motivating factor. So if the United States ends up being almost universally isolated in Iran, that won't be anything particularly new, and in fact there are quite a few other cases. Well, in the case of Iran, the reasons for U.S. concern are very clearly and repeatedly articulated. Iran is the gravest threat to world peace. We hear that regularly from high places, government officials, commentators, and others in the United States. There also happens to be a world out there, and it has its own opinions. It's quite easy to find these out from standard sources, like the main U.S. polling agency, Gallup Polls, takes regular polls of international opinion. And one of the questions posed is, which country do you think is the gravest threat to world peace? The answer is unequivocal. The United States, by a huge margin, way behind. In second place is Pakistan, inflated surely by the Indian vote, and then come a couple of others. Iran is mentioned, but along with Israel and a few others, way down. That's one of the things that it wouldn't do to say. And in fact, the results that are found by the leading U.S. polling agency didn't make it through the portals of what we call the free press, but it doesn't go away for that reason. Well, given the reigning doctrine about the gravity of the Iranian threat, we can understand the virtually unanimous stand that the United States is entitled to react with military force, unilaterally of course, if it claims to detect some Iranian departure from the terms of the agreement. So again, picking an example virtually at random from the national press, consider the lead editorial last Sunday in the Washington Post. It calls on Congress, I'll quote, to make clear that Mr. Obama or his successor will have support for immediate U.S. military action if an Iranian attempt to build a bomb is detected, meaning by the United States. So the editors again make it clear that the United States is exceptional. It's a rogue state, indifferent to international law and conventions. entitled to resort to violence at will. But the editors can't be faulted for that stand because it's almost universal among the political class in this exceptional nation, though what it means is, again, one of those things that it wouldn't do to say. Sometimes the doctrine takes quite a remarkable form, and not just on the right by any means. So take, for example, the Clinton doctrine. Namely, the United States is free to resort to unilateral use of military power, even for such purposes as to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources, let alone security or alleged humanitarian concerns. And adherence to this doctrine is very well confirmed in practice, as need hardly be discussed among people willing to look at the facts of current history. Well, the Washington Post editors also make clear why the United States should be prepared to take such extreme steps in its role of international primacy. If the United States is not prepared to resort to military force, they explain, then Iran may, I'm quoting, Iran may escalate its attempt to establish hegemony over the Middle East by force. It's what the President Obama, calls Iran's aggression, which we have to contain. For those who are unaware of how Iran has been attempting to establish hegemony over the Middle East by force, or might even dream of doing so, the editors do give examples, two examples. Its support for the Assad regime and for Hezbollah. Well, I won't insult your intelligence by discussing this demonstration that Iran has been seeking to establish hegemony over the region by force. However, on Iranian aggression, there is an example, I think one in the last several hundred years, namely Iranian conquest of two Arab islands in the Gulf under the US-backed regime of the Shah back in the 1970s. Well, these shocking Iranian efforts to establish regional hegemony by force can be contrasted with the actions of U.S. allies, for example, NATO ally Turkey, which is actively supporting the jihadi forces in Syria. Support is so strong that it appears that Turkey helped its allies in the al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front, to kill and capture the few dozen fighters that were introduced into Syria by the Pentagon a few weeks ago. It's the result of several years and who knows how many billions of dollars of training. They did enter and were immediately captured or killed, apparently with the aid of Turkish intelligence. Well, more important than that is the central role of the leading U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia, for the jihadi rebels in Syria and Iraq, and more generally for Saudi Arabia having been, I'm quoting, a major source of financing to rebel and terrorist organizations since the 1980s. That's from a recent study by the European Parliament, repeating what's well known. And still more generally, the